Right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our talk, BitUnlocker, leveraging Windows recovery to extract BitLocker secrets. Today, we'll take you inside our journey of attacking and securing BitLocker. We'll show you how we found, exploited, and fixed new vulnerabilities in the Windows recovery environment that allowed bypassing BitLocker and extracting all the BitLocker protected data. But just before we dive in, a quick introduction. So my name is Alon, and here with me on stage is Nathaniel. We're both security researchers working with the security testing and offensive research team at Microsoft, also known as Storm. Our expertise is in vulnerability research focused on everything that happens before the operating system fully loads, covering the various boot stages and its security features, including BitLocker, Secure Boot, and others. But enough about us, and let's dive into our agenda. So we'll start with the research background and give an overview of both BitLocker and WinRE. Then we'll dive into the vulnerabilities that we discovered, how we exploited them, and finally, we'll wrap up with our research results, the fixes, and actionable BitLocker countermeasures that you can apply today. So starting with the research background. Today, we'll explore a security feature that is designed to protect your sensitive data at rest. It aims to defend against theft scenarios where an attacker steals your laptop, aiming to extract your sensitive information, compromise your machine, and even backdoor it. You're here at Black Hat, surrounded by some of the brightest minds in cybersecurity, and let's be honest, some of the juiciest targets for hackers. Now picture this. You step away for a quick coffee break, and when you come back, your laptop is gone, stolen by a thief that is after your research, internal tools, credentials, and personal data. Without data trust protection, the thief can directly access the contents of the hard disk, extract sensitive data, or even modify system files, or install a backdoor and then return the laptop without detection. Data trust protection ensures that even if your laptop is stolen, your data remains encrypted and inaccessible, and your system remains untampered. Now, I know what you're thinking. The odds of your device getting stolen are so low that you're probably wondering if you should even bother worrying. So consider this. Studies show that a laptop is stolen every 53 seconds. The odds of a laptop being stolen are 1 in 10, and the average cost of a stolen laptop around $49,000. This figure reflects replacement costs, productivity loss, legal expenses, but most importantly, the loss of sensitive data and intellectual property. These numbers emphasize the criticality of data trust protection features, and with that, let's dive into our journey of attacking and securing BitLocker, which is Windows' data trust protection feature. So BitLocker is a full volume encryption technology that is designed to protect individual disk volumes. Once enabled, it encrypts the target disk volume, protecting all data that is stored on this volume. Now, users have the flexibility to choose which volumes to encrypt based on their specific needs, and by default, BitLocker targets the OS volume, ensuring that all data you store within the OS environment is protected. With BitLocker encryption in place, even if your laptop is stolen, the protected data remains unreadable because it's encrypted. The BitLocker threat model assumes an attacker similar to a common thief, which is someone with full physical access to the device, but without advanced credentials such as usernames or passwords. Naturally, BitLocker's attack surfaces are shaped by the interfaces that are accessible to such attacker fitting within this threat model. So as we examined the different attack surfaces, one stood out, a surface with significant vulnerability potential that surprisingly has received very little attention in prior research. This surface is the Windows recovery environment, also known as WinRE. Any BitLocker attacker can directly boot into WinRE by holding the Shift key while selecting Restart from the logon screen, rendering it a potential candidate for deeper inspection. Given WinRE's fit within the BitLocker threat model, the lack of prior research, and its high vulnerability potential, we decided to conduct a security review that is dedicated towards finding new vulnerabilities, exploiting them, fixing them, and then hardening WinRE and reducing its exposed attack surfaces. The end goal of our security review was to make both WinRE and BitLocker more secure and resilient. So let's take a closer look at WinRE, what it is, how it functions, and which areas present the most promising opportunities for vulnerability research. So WinRE is Windows' recovery platform. It's designed to address critical system issues such as startup failures, persistent crashes, BitLocker errors, and more. For instance, if your machine crashes, WinRE is responsible for analyzing the issue, identifying corruptions, and resolving it by using its recovery tools. If you use Windows, the chances are that you have encountered WinRE at least a few times in your lifetime. Architecturally, WinRE operates with its own standalone OS, known as the Recovery OS. The Recovery OS is a lean version of Windows with recovery-specific customizations. These customizations include a unique set of recovery tools that are all integrated into the known blue-screen recovery UI. Among the exposed recovery tools are the familiar options, such as startup repair, system reset, system restore, and other familiar options. For storage, the entire Recovery OS, including all the executables, DLLs, and drivers, all the system files, are basically compressed into a single WIM file named WinRE WIM. This WIM file is then stored on disk. Then, when WinRE boots, the entire WIM file is decompressed into RAM, creating a temporary RAM disk that hosts the Recovery OS runtime. Any changes made within this environment are not saved back to the original WinRE WIM file, making the Recovery OS runtime inherently volatile. Modifications to the RAM disk are discarded upon reboot. When BitLocker was first introduced, WinRE had to evolve to support recovery from BitLocker-related failures. And this led to several architectural and design changes to enable that BitLocker recovery functionality. So we wondered what impact these changes had. So let's take a closer look at them. The first design change focused on the location of the WinRE WIM file. It was moved from residing in the OS volume, which with BitLocker is now encrypted by BitLocker, to reside in a dedicated recovery volume. This change was necessary because WinRE must be able to recover from BitLocker-related failures. If the OS volume is encrypted and becomes inaccessible because of a decryption failure, for example, storing WinRE there would prevent recovery. Since WinRE is a critical component that must always be available, it was moved to a separate recovery volume, and this ensures that WinRE can function even if the OS volume is not accessible. The second design change focused on the integrity of the WinRE WIM file. So to support integrity validation of WinRE WIM, a feature called Trusted WIM Boot was introduced. It verifies WinRE's integrity by comparing its hash to a known trusted hash, so a simple hash comparison of WinRE WIM. If the hashes match, the OS volume is automatically unlocked. If the hashes do not match, the OS remains locked. Now, these two states, auto-unlocked and locked, define the level of access that WinRE has to the OS volume. In the auto-unlock state, WinRE has full access to the OS. It can perform recovery operations without any user intervention, whereas in the locked state, WinRE has no access at all to the OS volume. Now, this change, the introduction of Trusted WIM Boot, was necessary because WinRE now resides on an unprotected recovery volume, and it can no longer be blindly trusted. With Trusted WIM Boot, any unauthorized modification to WinRE WIM, for example, by a physical attacker, breaks this trust, effectively blocking any tampering. The third design change focused on limiting recovery tools that are inherently risky to BitLocker. For example, among the recovery tools is the command prompt. So to prevent a scenario where an attacker abuses the command prompt to access the BitLocker protected data, a volume relock functionality was added into WinRE. And this functionality is triggered every time that a risky recovery tool is selected, and it relocks the OS volume. So then, to regain access to the OS volume, the user must manually insert the BitLocker recovery key, and otherwise, all contents remain completely inaccessible. And this is how it looks like if an attacker launches the command prompt recovery tool, without inserting the BitLocker recovery key. Access to BitLocker encrypted volume will be denied, resulting in the following lock error. So to summarize the impact of the design changes, as long as WinRE WIM is trusted and no risky recovery tools are triggered, the OS volume is automatically unlocked, allowing WinRE to recover it without user intervention. In contrast, if WinRE WIM is modified without authorization, or if a risky recovery tool is triggered, the OS volume is relocked, preventing WinRE from accessing it. So now the critical question arises. Any attack surface is exposed because of these design adjustments? As it turned out, during the auto-unlock state, WinRE parses files from unprotected volumes, specifically the EFI volume and the recovery volume. This parsing presents a very interesting attack surface, which wasn't valuable to explore before BitLocker's introduction, since before BitLocker, there was no security boundary to cross. Before BitLocker, even full code execution within WinRE didn't grant a physical attacker any new capabilities. In contrast, with BitLocker, any code execution within WinRE during the auto-unlock state can be utilized to bypass BitLocker and extract all the protected secrets. We decided to dig deeper into these external files and see and examine their parsing. Specifically, the files that we will be focusing on today are the ReAgent.xml and Boot.sdi files residing in the recovery volume, and the boot configuration data store, the BCD store, residing in the EFI volume. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Netanel, who will walk us through the research process of the parsed external files.
Thanks, Alon. Let's begin with the Boot.sdi file. Now, the SDI stands for System Deployment Image Format, and it is optionally used for booting from virtual disk into RAM disk. This format consists of multiple binary blobs, with certain blobs being essential for the RAM disk boot process. Below, you can see the layout of the RAM disk in memory, which contains the OS disk image. When SDI file is specified, it gets prepended to the virtual disk within the allocated RAM disk memory region. In our scenario, we are trying to boot to Windows recovery from a WIM file. The Boot.sdi will contain a WIM blob, which contains an offset to the appended trusted WinRE WIM. Additionally, the Boot.sdi must contain an empty NTFS volume. This empty volume enables the in-memory WIM to be presented as NTFS volume, ensuring compatibility with other Windows components. Now, let's briefly examine a pseudocode that demonstrates this process. The code retrieves the sizes both of the SDI and WIM files, then allocates a buffer large enough for both. Next, the SDI data is copied to the beginning of the RAM disk image buffer. Then the WIM data is loaded and positioned immediately after the SDI data. During this process, the loading API computes the WIM hash for validation. If the hash validation fails, the main OS volume gets locked. And finally, the WIM address is determined by adding the WIM offset stored in the SDI to the RAM disk buffer address. Notably, there is no verification linking between the WIM being used to the one that was hashed earlier, allowing the offset to be set arbitrarily. With that in mind, let's dive into our first vulnerability. We know that WinRE WIM must pass hash validation when loaded immediately after the SDI. However, the Boot.sdi itself undergoes no validation whatsoever. Since we can manipulate the WIM offset to point to an arbitrary location, we could append an untrusted WIM to the SDI and adjust the offset to point to it. The hash validation for the trusted WIM will succeed, but the untrusted WIM will be executed in its place. This allows us to load and execute any WIM we choose while keeping the main OS volume still unlocked. Now let's see a demo for the first vulnerability. Here's a locked machine, which we don't have the password for it. So now we press on the Shift Restart to reboot into WinRE. And inside WinRE, we will run the exploit we prepared beforehand. Now during boot, the main OS volume gets automatically unlocked by BitLocker. We reach WinRE UI actions, we select troubleshoot. Then we select advanced options, command prompt. Now the main OS volume got locked. It requires a key, we don't have it, so we skip this drive. Now we try to access C drive, but we can't access it. It says locked by BitLocker. If we check the BitLocker status, we're going to see it says locked. Now we change path to the D drive, which is the mounted recovery volume, the unprotected volume. We execute the exploit we prepared beforehand. Now we appended the custom WIM to the Boot.sdi. We adjusted the offset to point to it. And at this point, we have only to reboot the machine back to WinRE. Now, instead of going to WinRE UI actions, we expect the custom boot to load, which we set CMD to launch. Here is the CMD. We can change path to C drive. If we check the BitLocker status now, you can see that it says unlocked, and above it, the protection is still on. And if we list all the files under the C drive, we can view all the secrets. There it is. After we completed our review for Boot.sdi, we shifted our attention to ReAgent.xml to search for vulnerabilities. The ReAgent.xml file contains the current recovery state and other configuration settings for WinRE. Upon WinRE startup, it immediately consumes and parses this XML file. When WinRE state is configured to execute a scheduled operation, it will run the designated recovery operations such as startup repair or other tasks, and all of these occur prior to reaching the UI actions you've seen before. Today, we will talk about two scheduled recovery operations that can get arbitrarily executed by modifying the state in ReAgent.xml. First, offline scanning, and then WinRE applications. Starting with offline scanning operation. This operation allows running AV scan from within WinRE against the main OS volume. It is mainly used against malware that does not run inside WinRE. We found we can control which app performs the scanning, though there are a couple limitations. First, offline scanning is performed only by executing applications from within the main OS volume. Second, this application must be digitally signed by Microsoft or WHQL. And third, the signatures must be embedded within the binary itself. We searched for all default applications that satisfy these requirements, and we discover approximately 30 applications. No, CMD is not among them. And we could not execute all the applications on that list, mainly due to compatibility reasons. We reviewed them one by one until we got to application named tttracer. This application is a time travel debugger utility that allows tracing an arbitrary executable. OK, so if we can trace anything we want, let's trace CMD then, right? Now let's go over the full exploitation steps of the second vulnerability. Before starting the machine, we set recovery state in our ReAgent.xml to schedule the offline scanning operation. The XML is then parsed by WinRE. Then, according to the state we just set, WinRE performs the scheduled operation, which is offline scanning. It will execute tttracer, which will trace any binary set. We specified CMD. So in our case, it will launch and trace CMD. And at this specific point, while still in auto unlock state, we have a shell access with the main OS volume fully unencrypted. Let's see a quick demo for the second vulnerability. So again, is a locked machine with a password protected, which you don't have the password. We shift restart again to boot into WinRE to execute our exploit. Now the main OS volume got automatically unlocked. We reach WinRE UI actions, select troubleshoot, then advanced options and command prompts. Now again, the main OS got locked. We don't have the key, so we skip this drive. If we try to access C, you can see it says this drive is locked by BitLocker. If we check the BitLocker status, you can see it says locked. Now we will change path to D drive, which is the recovery volume, the unprotected volume. We will run the exploit we prepared beforehand. We set tttracer to get scheduled in the offline scanning operation. And we also set it to run the CMD, to trace and run CMD. Now with the exploit completed, we reboot the machine back to WinRE. Only this time, instead of seeing the UI actions you've seen before, we expect to see tttracer, the application we scheduled. Here is tttracer. It asks us to accept the EULA. We accept it. And immediately after that, we can see the CMD is spawning. It launched. Now we can change the drive to C. If we check the BitLocker status, here it says unlocked and protection is still on. And again, if we list all the files under the C drive, we can view the secrets. Here they are. So we completed going over the offline scanning. So let's proceed to WinRE applications. Another scheduled operation we can configure is WinRE apps, which allow us to run applications within WinRE. If this application are trusted, they get executed while the main OS remains in auto unlock state. Otherwise, they run after the main OS volume has been relocked. We went looking for the hash validation process, and we found that trusted applications are registered in the WinRE registry using their executable name and the file hash. This registry resides within the WIM file, and the physical attacker cannot modify it. Any alterations to the WIM will change its hash, causing the main OS volume to be relocked during boot hash validation. Now, when our WinRE is scheduled to run trusted application, it first calculates the hash of the target application and then searches for a match in the registry. If a match is found, the application is marked as trusted. If no match exists, the application is marked as untrusted. The main OS volume gets relocked, and later the application gets executed. Overall, that sounds as WinRE trusted applications validation is solid and works properly, right? Well, we wondered if an already registered application can expose an attack surface. So we went hunting for registered applications. We found a legitimate usage of this feature by a program called Setup Platform. This application is registered as trusted app and used during the Windows upgrade. Only once the upgrade completes, the trusted app entry remains in the registry, and it is not removed. So we can execute Setup Platform, but what else can we do with it? We found that it registers Shift plus F10 hotkey to launch CMD. We tried that, but it fails to execute due to missing configuration on the main OS volume. Since this configuration file resides on the BitLocker protected main OS volume, it cannot be created or edited. This configuration requirements cause Setup Platform to terminate early when the file is absent. Now, the time window between the hotkey registration and the process exit is very short. It's quite impossible to trigger CMD using this hotkey manually. So we still wanted to find another way to trigger CMD, so we went back to analyze Setup Platform. Now, this is when we discovered something really interesting. Immediately after registering the CMD hotkey, this application, it searches for a Setup Platform INI file on the recovery volume, which is the unprotected volume. Now, by configuring this file properly, Setup Platform will trigger a message box, which prevents the application from continuing the execution, essentially blocking the application from early termination. That will open an infinite time window to spawn CMD and type anything we want in it. Let's view the complete flow. So we modify ReAgent.xml to set for scheduling trusted app. More specifically, we set a platform to get executed. WinRE then validates that this app can be trusted. The validation succeeds, and the main OS volume remains unlocked. Next, Setup Platform gets executed. It registers the hotkey for CMD, which is Shift plus F10. It then looks for Setup Platform INI file and loads it, which will trigger a message box. This way, the process gets blocked and won't continue until we press OK. Now, we can simply press on Shift plus F10 to trigger CMD, and we get a shell up and running while the main OS volume is still unlocked. Let's see a demo for the third vulnerability. So again, here's the locked machine, which you don't have the password for it. We shift restart to reboot into WinRE. We reached WinRE, we select troubleshoot and then advanced options, command prompt. Now again, the main OS got locked, we don't have the key, so we skip this drive. We'll try to access C drive again, it says locked. We'll check the BitLocker status. Again, it says locked on both. Now we'll run the exploit, resides on the recovery volume, the unprotected volume. We set Setup Platform as a trusted app. We also set the Setup Platform INI file. And once the exploit completed, we reboot the machine. Now, instead of seeing the UI actions you've seen before, we expect a message box to appear, right? From Setup Platform. Here's the message box. Now we can simply press on Shift F10, we spawn the CMD. We can change path to C drive. If we check the BitLocker status, you can see it says protection is still on, and the volume is unlocked. And if we list the files under the C drive, we can view all the secrets again. Here it is. Now, Alon will continue to talk about the BCD parsing attack surface.
Thanks, Nathaniel. So let's move on to attacking the BCD parsing in WinRE. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the BCD and what it stands for, BCD stands for boot configuration data, and it's the file that defines how Windows boots. It stores the boot entries, controls the boot parameters, recovery settings, and many more boot-related configurations. Now, in the context of WinRE, the usage of BCD is considerably minimal. WinRE uses BCD mainly to determine the location of the target OS volume on disk, so that WinRE knows which volume to end the recovery operations to, right? Because we have multiple volumes on the disk, and WinRE must know which volume to end the recovery to. So when WinRE starts, it reads the BCD store, queries the target OS volume from the BCD, and then ends the recovery operations to this volume that the BCD specified. So the first question that came into our minds when we investigated WinRE BCD usage is what can we potentially gain from targeting it? As it turns out, WinRE places full trust in the target OS, assuming that it's out of attacker's reach. Now, this assumption is actually solid from a design perspective, because with BitLocker enabled, the target OS volume is encrypted, and an attacker has no access to it whatsoever. So it's OK to place their configurations, query configurations, assuming it's out of attacker's reach. Having said that, since the target OS location is defined in the BCD, which we can modify, we began to question this trust assumption. Could BCD manipulations allow us to undermine it? So what if we could trick WinRE into thinking that an attacker-controlled volume is the trusted BitLocker encrypted one, sort of confusing WinRE here? So our focus has shifted towards identifying a primitive that allows impersonating the target OS location. The goal is to manipulate the target OS volume to point to an attacker-controlled volume, such as the recovery volume, instead of pointing to the trusted BitLocker encrypted volume, which we can't modify. But the recovery we can modify. So this primitive, if gained, would break the trust assumption. Now, we already know that the target OS location is controlled in the BCD store, which we can directly modify. So what happens if we change the location directly in the BCD store? Well, theoretically, it's possible, but it isn't valuable. Let me explain. The target OS location isn't used only by WinRE, but also used by the boot manager, which uses it to know which volume it should auto-unlock for WinRE. Any change to the shared store affects both the boot and OS phases. In this specific scenario, modifying the target OS location to point to the recovery volume prevents the boot manager from auto-unlocking the BitLocker encrypted OS volume that contains the secrets. And these are the secrets that we want to extract. So this breaks the trust assumption, but even with full code execution within WinRE, BitLocker secrets remain inaccessible and locked. That's why it's not valuable. So our primitive must not interfere with the boot procedure and not interfere with the auto-unlock functionality. So we must go deeper. We decided to dig deeper into the way that WinRE searches for the BCD store. Any potential flaws at this stage wouldn't interfere with the auto-unlock functionality because it executes afterwards, after the OS volume has already been unlocked. So to locate the BCD store, WinRE basically iterates over disk volumes and searches each volume for a BCD store. The first store that is found is the one used by WinRE to further calculate the target OS location. Now, this volume iteration logic is a very interesting point to further inspect. And the reason is that only the EFI volume contains the BCD store. So any attempt to locate this store on other volumes could potentially be abused, especially if the other volumes are controlled by an attacker. Internally, the functions that are used to iterate over the volumes are two standard Windows APIs, findVerseVolume and findNextVolume. And notably, the remarks section of these two APIs highlight a very interesting point. It highlights that one should not assume any correlation between the order of the volumes that are returned by these functions and the order of the volumes that are on the computer. The reason being is that under the hood, these two functions perform further filtering and sorting, which causes an inconsistency in the returned volume order. On the monitor, you can see the typical volume order returned by this part list vol command. The order is first OS, then EFI, and only then the recovery volume. However, the volume iteration functions would return a slightly different order. First the OS, then the recovery, and only then the EFI. Can you spot the inconsistency here? With the volume iteration functions, the recovery volume is iterated over and checked for a BCD store before the EFI volume. By placing a custom attacker-controlled store in the recovery volume, we can trick WinRE into using it instead of using the EFI BCD store. And with this setup, WinRE doesn't even reach the point of querying the EFI volume for a BCD store. It just uses the first store that it finds in the recovery volume. So any modification or corruption we make to that attacker store will only impact WinRE and will not interfere with the auto-unlock functionality at all. This flow allows us to achieve the desired primitive. During the boot phase, the boot manager locates and uses the legitimate BCD store from the E5 volume to unlock the BitLocker encrypted OS volume. So now this OS volume, if we get code execution, we can extract the secrets from, and we are after these secrets. However, during the OS phase, WinRE instead locates and uses the attacker-controlled BCD store in the recovery volume. This is due to the lookup logic, which we just explored. And this leads WinRE to consider an attacker-controlled volume as the BitLocker encrypted volume. So we gained the confusion primitive. And with this primitive, any configuration that WinRE retrieves from the target OS, previously assumed to be beyond an attacker's reach, is now entirely under the attacker's control. To further exploit this powerful primitive, we need to find a WinRE flow with three characteristics. First, a flow that can be triggered either from WinRE UI or ReAgent.xml scheduled operations, so that we're able to trigger this flow freely. Second, a flow that doesn't trigger the relock functionality, so that we won't lose access to the secret, right? Because we need to access the secrets, and if we trigger a flow that triggers the relock, we won't have access to the secrets. The third characteristic is a flow that queries configuration from the target OS to perform sensitive operations. And this is important. The idea here is to chain the WinRE flow that we will potentially find with, again, the impersonation primitive to trigger sensitive operations in the auto-unlock state, operations that we wouldn't have the possibility to control beforehand or to trigger beforehand. After exploring the different WinRE behaviors, we found a potential candidate, the push button reset feature, or PBR for short. So PBR is Windows' system reset tool, and it provides various reset functionalities. It supports multiple trigger modes, with one of its modes, known as online PBR, meeting the characteristics that we defined for the exploit. Online PBR can be triggered freely as a scheduled operation in ReAgent.xml. It doesn't trigger the relock functionality, thereby it benefits auto-unlock. And it queries configuration from the target OS to perform sensitive operations. Thereby, these configurations, although we wouldn't be able to control them before the impersonation, we can now control these configurations with the impersonation primitive. Specifically, the sensitive configurations that we identified was an XML file named reset-session.xml, which defines all operations executed by PBR. Notably, it includes the decrypt volume directive, which instructs PBR to decrypt any arbitrary BitLocker encrypted volume. So this is very interesting. We now have all the pieces that are required for the full BitLocker bypass. The exploit required modifying few files in the recovery volume. First, the XML, the ReAgent.xml with online PBR operation. Second, to modify the BCD store with the OS device pointing to the recovery volume instead of pointing to the OS volume. And then to modify the PBR configuration, and specifically with reset session and the decrypt volume operation specifying the BitLocker encrypted OS volume as the target volume to decrypt as part of PBR. With this setup, the next WinRE boot will go through online PBR flow. During the BCD store lookup, PBR will locate the attacker BCD store and mistakenly identify its target volume as the recovery volume. Consequentially, PBR will load its configuration from the recovery volume, which instructs it to decrypt the BitLocker encrypted OS volume. Once PBR completes, BitLocker secrets become freely accessible, as BitLocker was essentially disabled by PBR. So we went from a limited OS impersonation primitive to an arbitrary volume decryption primitive. With that, let's see the demo of the full exploitation chain. So we have here a locked machine. We don't have the password to it, as usual. So we select restart while selecting the shift key to reboot into WinRE. While inside WinRE, we select troubleshoot, advanced options, and then command prompt. At this point, the recovery key will be requested, which we don't have it. So we skip this drive. And as a result of skipping the drive, you'll see that the C drive is locked, the main OS is locked. We don't have access to the secrets whatsoever. As you can see, the state of BitLocker is fully locked. So we'll now change drive to the D drive. This is the mounted recovery volume. To our exploit files directory, where we place the exploit. We execute the exploit. And now all that we need to do is to restart into WinRE in order for the exploit to trigger. So now we'll restart into WinRE, and the PBR will start. It will take a few seconds, so we fast it forward a bit. So you'll see on the screen now PBR resetting this PC, but let me tell you what the exploit did. It basically scheduled online PBR placed the BCD store on the recovery volume, so that when PBR looks this BCD store, it locates the attacker BCD store. This store pointed to the OS volume. This store pointed to the recovery volume as the OS device. We placed the PBR configuration in that device as well. And this PBR configuration tells PBR to decrypt the OS volume, the main OS volume with the secrets. So under the hood, what happens here is that the main OS volume that was encrypted is now being decrypted by PBR. This is what happens under the hood. So now PBR finishes, and we continue into the main OS. We'll go back to the main OS. Now you will see the logon screen. At this point, of course, we still don't have the password. Nothing has changed. But let's reboot into WinRE to check what is the current state of BitLocker. So we're back in WinRE. We select Troubleshoot, Advanced Options, Command Prompt. But the recovery key is not requested here. If we change the directory to the C drive, to the main OS, you can see that we have access to the secrets. And if you wonder why we have such access without relocking the volume, without requesting the recovery key, let's check what is the current state of BitLocker. You'll see that the protection is off, and the drive is fully decrypted. So essentially, disabled BitLocker, able to extract all the BitLocker secrets. Thank you. So closing remarks, starting with the vulnerability fixes. So all the discovered vulnerabilities and their exploitation techniques were fixed in July's Patch Tuesday. The CVEs for the vulnerabilities that we presented today are displayed on the screen. To further enhance the security of BitLocker, we recommend enabling TPM plus PIN for pre-boot authentication. This significantly reduces the BitLocker attack surfaces by limiting exposure only to the TPM. So if TPM plus PIN is already enabled on your machine, or if you enable it, you're fully protected from BitLocker bypasses that originate from WinRE, specifically from boot components, from logon screen, and other attack surfaces. To mitigate BitLocker downgrade attacks, we advise enabling the revise mitigation. This mechanism enforces secure versioning across critical boot components, preventing downgrades that could reintroduce known vulnerabilities in BitLocker and secure boot. For the full article in BitLocker countermeasures, please scan the QR code on the screen. Lastly, we want to emphasize that our journey never ends. We continue to proactively research BitLocker, WinRE, and the related components with the never-ending goal of increasing their security and resiliency. It was a pleasure to share with you our research project and the security work that we've been doing on WinRE and BitLocker. If you have any questions, please catch us in the wrap-up room and feel free to reach out on social media as well. And with that, we would like to thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.